Hi everybody and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Dr. Michala Hulme and in this week's episode I'm going to be talking to you about the British Census. I don't know if I should have done that more dramatic. I'll do it again. Hi everybody and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this week's episode I'm going to be talking to you about the British Census. Now, I'm a massive fan of the census. I love the census. And if you've seen me do any work, for example, on the TV or on the radio, you'll know that I'm always harping on about census records. I think they are brilliant. I think they're probably the quickest and the easiest way to track your ancestors throughout the early 20th and into the 19th century. Now, I'm going to start this video by talking about the 1841 census. There were censuses before this date. However, they were only partial and don't really contain much information. They're a bit more like a head count. From 1841 onwards, every 10 years, we get a census record. Up to 1911, there are 100-year closure orders on them. We will get the 1921 census, but we're not going to get that until January 2022. So we've got just a bit of time to wait for that yet. Now, the 1841 census is interesting. It doesn't contain as much information as the other censuses, and there are certain things that we need to be mindful of when we are working with this census. So the first thing we need to be mindful of is ages. If the person listed on the census is under the age of 15, their age should be accurate, kind of. If you watch my other video, which is somewhere up here, on things I've known before I started my family tree, you'll know that our ancestors, particularly in the 19th century, had no real idea when they were born. If your ancestors are anything like mine, they just kind of guessed. Anyway, ages. So anybody listed under the age of 15 on the census should have had their age written down accurately. Anybody over the age of 15, their age would have been rounded down to the nearest multiple of 5. And that's not always the case, by the way. You do need to check. Some people actually rounded their age up to the nearest multiple of 5. But it should have been rounded down to the nearest multiple of 5. Those pesky Victorians. So what other information can we get from the census? Okay, so we're going to get names. I've already mentioned about ages. We're also going to get an address. Now, the address tends to be on the 1841 census, not as detailed as other censuses. So, for example, you probably will just get something like a road name. You might not get a house number or a house name, but you normally do get a road name. The census also tells us if the person we were looking at was born in the county. And for this, you're either going to get a Y for yes, an N for no, or an NK for not known. If the person you are looking at was born in Scotland, you're going to get an S, you're going to get a W for Wales, and so forth. So alongside name, age, address, and whether or not that person was born in the county, we also do get occupation. And it's really interesting to track how your ancestors' occupation has changed maybe over the 19th century. Now, there is something that we don't get on this census that we do get on other censuses, and that is the relationship to the head of the household. So be mindful when you are looking at this census, if you've got 3 people living there, yes, it could be, husband, wife, and sister-in-law. It would just be that those 3 people were all siblings. So we don't get any sort of relationship status in the 1841 census. Now, it is worth noting that your ancestor may be missing from their home on the census. That doesn't mean that they didn't live there, it just means that on the night the census was taken, they were not present at home. So let's move on to the 1851 census. Well, between the 1851 census and the 1901 census, not much changes. But we do have more in-depth information than what we had on the 1841 census. So Like the 1841 census, we have name and we have address, but also now we have relationship to the head of the household. So for the first time, you can see how these people are related. We also have age. Unlike the 1841 census, the age is now recorded precisely, or as precise as your ancestors know their age. We also have conditions of marriage. So we get to find out if your ancestor is single, married, or a widower. We have occupation, and on the 1891 and the 1901 census, it now says whether they were an employee or employer. So were they self-employed or not? We also have a place of birth, which is great because you're able now to track and see where your ancestors were born and where they had moved to. If they were born outside of the country, normally you just get the country. There has been a few instances where I've also had a place within that country, an area should I say, within that country. But most of the time you will just get the country of where your ancestor was born. And there is also another box which charts the mental and physical condition of your ancestors. And a bit of a word of warning here, the language used in that column is not language that we would use today. For example, in 1901, the column asks whether your ancestor was a lunatic, an imbecile, or feeble-minded. If you have any questions about the census, please drop them in the comments below. And have you used the census? Who have you found on the census? If you have any census stories, please pop them in the comments. I will read and reply to them all. So that takes us up to 1901, but what happens after 1901? Well, we then have the 1911 census. This, I've already spoken about how I love census records, but the 1911 census is my absolute favourite census record. Not only do I love census records, I have a favourite, and it's the 1911 census. Oh yes. The reason I love this census so much is that now we get a description or some kind of description of what the house was like that our ancestors lived in. It actually tells you how many rooms there are in the house. Amazing. Also, it gives us more information about, for example, how long our ancestors have been married, which is great if you're trying to find a marriage certificate and you've been stumped and you're not quite sure where to go. Have a look on the 1911 census because it tells you how long your ancestor has been married. It also tells us how many children our ancestor has had, how many were born alive, and how many have died. Again, this is really useful information if you're building your family tree to find ancestors that we may have missed because they fall in between census records. So if you have an ancestor that was born in, for example, 1903 and died in 1906, you may have missed them off your tree. So if you look on the 1911 census, it's going to tell you how many children the person had that was born alive and how many children the person had that had died. Another interesting factor about the 1911 census is that it was actually filled out by your ancestor. Yes, that is true. So if you have a look at the handwriting and the signature on that census, that is actually the handwriting of your relative, of your ancestor. And I think that's pretty cool. In January of 2022, we're gonna get the 1921 census, and I'm really excited about this census. It's going to be the first census that was taken after World War I, which will be interesting in itself because we know that a lot of World War I records were destroyed in the Blitz. So this may give you some information on what has happened to your ancestor. I have an ancestor that I cannot find. I can't find a military record for them for World War I, and I don't know what happens to them after World War I. So I can't wait for this census. Now, what is also going to be interesting about the 1921 census is that it was the first census taken after some women got the vote, not all. If you have an ancestor that was a suffragette, you may have found when you looked at the 1911 census that they had defaced it. I'm actually gutted because none of mine were public suffragettes, so nobody had defaced the census. However, I did do an episode of Who Do You Think You Are where the celebrity involved did actually have an ancestor who was a suffragette, and that was really exciting. The 1921 census is also going to give us some slightly different information to the 1911 census. So we're going to get a more in-depth understanding of what our ancestor did for a job, for example. So not only do we know their occupation now, but we're also going to know what industry they worked in and who was their employer. We are also going to get a bit more of an in-depth understanding about our ancestor's education. We're also going to find out for the first time if our ancestor has been divorced. I know, how exciting is this? Now, divorce was very expensive. It was a very costly and time-consuming procedure. So it was quite hard to get a divorce in 1921. People did separate, but to actually get divorced, as I say, was quite costly. And if you're a working class person, the chances are this would have been financially out of your reach. Also, for the first time, we're going to find out for all those under the age of 15 whether their parents are still alive or whether they are deceased. Again, this is going to be really useful if you are looking for somebody and you can't find them. This will be another clue as to whether they are still alive or whether they have died. So I am super excited about the 1921 census, which we will get in January 2022. So that is it for this week's video. I really hope you have enjoyed learning about census records. Don't forget, if you like anything you have seen, please like and subscribe below, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thanks for watching.